To begin today, I would like to begin today's proceedings acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend the respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Today I'm standing in for President of the Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Glenn Withers, who is without a voice today. So my name is Sunny Hudson and I'm the Academy's Public Engagement Manager. And welcome all today, thank you for coming. I'm most excited to be a part of today's event, which is occurring during the inaugural Social Sciences Week, promoting social sciences around the whole country, all this week. And we have the pleasure of co-hosting our Academy's 2018 Peter Karmel Forum in Public Policy with the Australasian Council of the Deans of Arts and Social Sciences and Humanities. So the Academy, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, promotes excellence in the social sciences in Australia and in their contribution to public policy. We are an autonomous, not-for-profit devoted to the advancement of knowledge and research across the truly broad church of social sciences. Above all else, the social sciences contribute to the public good and work in their interest. Our Public Forums program, much like Social Sciences Week, is all about raising awareness of the social sciences within the community, amongst policymakers and opinion leaders, and to highlight the relevance of social sciences for public policy. This particular forum, the Peter Karmel Forum, honours the late Professor Peter Karmel AC, who had a profound impact on higher education and public policy in Australia over many decades. Professor Karmel was also a past president of the Academy. The lecture is intended to provoke public discussion on a particular policy of Australian government, the policy-making process itself, or comparisons of policies or policy processes found in Australia and other jurisdictions. So, if you're feeling provoked and in any way inclined, and are of a tweeting disposition, we have some handles that you might like to use today. So the Academy of Social Sciences is at @ACADSocSci with the hashtag Social Science Matters. And we also are promoting @SocSci Week, hashtag SSW 2018. Now I would like to hand over to our fabulous facilitator, Michael Wesley, who is a Professor of International Affairs and the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU. He's published on Australian foreign policy, Asia's international relations and strategic affairs, and the politics of state-building interventions. His book, There Goes the Neighbourhood, Australia and the Rise of Asia 2011, was awarded the John Button Prize for the best writing on Australian politics and public policy. Previously, Professor Wesley was the Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at ANU, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy, Director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University, and Assistant Director General for Transnational Issues at the Office of National Assessments, Australia's peak intelligence agency. Welcome everybody. I'm now going to hand it all over to you.
Sunny, thank you, and thanks for that very generous introduction. I shouldn't have let my mother write my bio notes. Look, this is a wonderful opportunity to do something in partnership with the Academy of Social Sciences. I'm here along with my fellow Dean Ray Francis, the Dean of the College of Arts and Social Sciences at ANU. We are hosting the Deans of Arts and Social Sciences and Humanities Conference, an annual conference of the Deans of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities in Australia and New Zealand universities, and we're doing that over the next couple of days here in Canberra as well. So a great opportunity for us to get together and talk about why social science matters and some of the challenges that face social sciences, and what better topic for us to be grappling with than the assault on expertise. and people like Michael Gove, or should I say people like Donald Trump, who tend to use the term expert as a term of abuse and a term of derision. And so it's fantastic that we've got such a wonderful and varied panel today, drawn from both academia and the policy realm, and some of whom who've worked in both realms, who can reflect on these issues. So let me very quickly introduce our wonderful panellists. To my right is Sarah Burr. She's a senior advisor in the Indigenous Affairs Group at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, leading a team designing and implementing remote small business development initiatives across Australia. Sarah is a proud Wiradjuri, Yorta Yorta and Bungandij woman and has qualifications in Indigenous interpreting, public administration and environmental management, and a Masters in Agribusiness from the University of Melbourne. She holds roles as Vice President at YWCA Canberra, as Deputy Chair of the ABC Advisory Council, and as a member of the University of Canberra's Indigenous Advisory Council. Next to Sarah is Linda Botterill. She is a Professor in Australian Politics in the School of Government and Policy, Faculty of Business Government and Law at the University of Canberra. She is a political scientist working in the areas of Australian politics, public policy and political psychology. The main focus of her work is the role of values in politics and policy. Prior to commencing her academic career, she worked as a policy practitioner, including over a decade in the APS as an advisor to 2 ministers in the Keating government and as senior policy advisor into industry associations. Next to Linda is Carolyn Hendricks. She's an associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Carolyn has a background in both political science and environmental engineering. Her work examines democratic aspects of contemporary governance, including participation, deliberation, inclusion and representation. She's taught and published widely on the application and politics of inclusive and deliberative forms of citizen engagement. She's led numerous empirical projects in Australia, Germany and the Netherlands on the role of interests, power, networks, markets and elites in participatory modes of governing. Her recent research work is exploring alternative modes of political participation, particularly those enabled by online and offline spaces of political contestation. Our fourth panellist is Deborah Lupton. She is a centenary research professor associated with the News and Media Research Centre in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. She's a sociologist and a media studies researcher who's researched the social and cultural aspects of medicine and public health, parenting, culture, the body, risk, fear of crime, digital technologies and the emotions, fat politics, food and HIV/AIDS. Her latest research focuses on critical digital health studies, big data cultures, the sociology of self-tracking and digital sociology. Welcome to you all, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as a way of getting into this topic, we've asked each of our panellists to talk for about 5 minutes on their own personal perspective on expertise and some of the negative reactions to expertise that they might have experienced and how they think we should be dealing with it. So, Sarah, we might start with you.
Sure. So thank you for having me today. I'm essentially a public servant. So every day we are required to advise the government of the day on the issues that we're tasked with to provide policy solutions, to deal with different issues that may have come up, to find a way around something sometimes as opposed to a way through it. And that can be really challenging. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I know that I'm still learning so many things. I know that I don't hold cultural authority in my communities to be an expert in many things. I know that there's some things I never will be able to by virtue of my gender or by virtue of my position in community and that kind of thing. And that's really important to acknowledge and know that not only are you sort of acting with humility in some circumstances, you're also acting in a deferential way. So I often find that maybe I do know the academic answer, but it's not for me to respond to. So there's those sorts of considerations around me in my role currently. And that can be really challenging to try to explain in a system that is designed around, quite heavily structured around patriarchal, structural norms and has certain hierarchical requirements that you might draft something, but somebody else looks at it before the next person looks at it, before the next person looks at it, before it gets to the minister's office. And in there's a hierarchy that these things go through. And so it's a very, you know that what you have put in, you can try, you can force, you can push, you can advocate, you can advise. Reading out my bio, like I'm involved in a lot of advisory things, but you know that people do with that information what they will. And that's the challenge, I think, of being a policy advisor today. Probably has been for a very long time, and I'm sure that Linda has a lot of experience in this too, but it is highly frustrating. You know that you're the person that's been out speaking to a community that is in need. It is a community that has its own local ideas of what a solution might look like. They know what their own local challenges, barriers, opportunities, that sort of thing are. You can synthesise that information. You can tie it in with your potentially an academic background or with other experts that you liaise with. You have networks that go much broader. You know people in this space, all that kind of thing. You're bringing it all together and you advise up. And where that ends up is sometimes not really where you had hoped, and oftentimes it's really not where the community had hoped either. And so I think a lot of this stuff really has to happen in a context. I think often we have ministers who say, I need this done and I want to act in this particular direction. That's all well and good, but have you considered what life is really like on the ground? This is people's lives. This isn't just an abstract idea occurring in a vacuum. So that's sort of like just a day-to-day kind of thing that you're dealing with, whether it's something small, a small brief, or whether it's designing an entire policy response or an entire program. And I think that that's quite challenging because Australian society doesn't expect that. They expect this is a problem, there will be a solution. They expect we have elected these individuals to represent us. We expect that they listen to our needs and that they respond in kind. And I think that that is such a difficult kind of thing to come at when you do have such challenges in the way, not just structurally, the way that our departments and political advisors are sort of engaging with each other, often not very nicely, and where these things end up. There's also then the political debate, you think you've got it there, it's up in the minister's office, he's advocating or she's advocating for that position that you've put up, and then it goes for further debate. And these things get sort of pushed and swayed and all sorts of things in all directions. Things get traded off. People go, oh yeah, we can carve that part of the policy off because, this micro party really wants this other thing to happen. And that can really result in something we were discussing earlier. It results in the camel. You were asked to design a horse and you came out with a camel. And those sorts of things are such a challenge in reality because the people on the ground didn't ask for that. And I think that that's the real challenge that we're dealing with in the real political advisor space. So I might leave it there and answer the questions later.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective which might challenge some of the things that Sarah has said. For me, policy making is the business end of politics. We elect our politicians to do stuff on our behalf. And unfortunately, decision making in any environment is not straightforward. It is a values balancing exercise. So every choice that we make, we've got those trade-offs that Sarah mentioned. We're balancing conflicting values. And those that we've elected to power are balancing conflicting societal values. And people in the community who have voted at an election expect that their values are going to be heard to some extent in the outcomes that come forward. So we're going to end up with the camel because not everybody agrees we need a horse. Some people think we need something completely different. And the research that comes out of social psychology tells us that although we collectively hold about 10 universal human values, we rank them differently. So for some of us, national security is more important than humanitarian consideration for refugees, and government's got to navigate that space between the different positions. Expertise and evidence then become tools, basically, in the process of persuasion. So no evidence is either sought or presented without a purpose. So experts come forward with expertise in a particular area because they think something needs to be done, because they've got some particular values or particular perspectives that they want to promote. No expertise, and particularly in the social sciences, is value-free. We choose what we want to research because we think it's important. So people who research river red gums as opposed to radiata pine have got particular views about particular issues. They know what they believe is important, and they've made values-based choices before they've even started. And I think this is probably one of the problems that we've got to with this sense that people are no longer listening to experts or respecting their advice, is that we've sort of forgotten that no expertise is objective delivery of the facts. Everything is constructed as some sort of argument to promote a particular values position. Now, one of the trendy terms around the public service over the last decade or so has been the term wicked problems. And wicked problems was first used in an article in 1973 by a couple of authors called Rettell and Weber. And that article actually answers the questions that we're talking about today. They were deliberating in 1973 about why the public was not listening to experts. And they actually referred to the public as being perverse because it wouldn't listen to expertise. So why don't they listen? Well, I wonder whether one of the reasons that they might not be listening, if indeed they're not listening, is because we're not very good at engaging with the public. There's become, and I think part of the problem is a result of the evidence-based policy movement, is the sense that the expertise or the expert should trump everything else. Now, if you accept my premise that in a democracy everybody has a right to be heard and to have their views listened to, that means that expertise isn't going to trump the decisions that we're making. Every decision has a trade-off. And experts don't agree. I'm sure there's lots of circumstances where political scientists and economists don't agree on what the best way is forward for politics. And even economists themselves don't agree amongst themselves. So we can't expect the public to go, yep, the expert has spoken and that is determinant. So what we need to be doing is recognising that expertise is part of a conversation in the democratic policy making process, and it's part of a conversation that involves persuasion. If we look at the research that's been done on rhetoric and persuasion for centuries, the starting point for effective persuasion is common values. Where do we agree on things? And now let's move from there to see how we can start arriving at solutions that we all agree with. Now, none of those solutions are going to be the horse that we set out to devise in the first place. We are inevitably going to end up with camels. But I think we need to recognise that not that the policy process has failed because our elected politicians have brought their views in as representatives of people in democracy, but that the policy process is lively and dynamic, and it's responding to those different values perceptions and different values perspectives in the community. So I don't think we are ignoring our experts. We certainly need them, and I know when I got my car serviced last week, I was very glad that somebody knew what was going on under the bonnet and I could trust them. And I trust my dentist when I go to the dentist. So we do need experts and we trust them. But as soon as you start getting into the social sciences and into public policy questions, you start getting into this area of values choice. Even the very way we define the policy problem is value-laden. Is the problem of refugees a lot of people who are just trying to get into Australia for economic futures, or is it desperate people fleeing horrible situations? Are the unemployed just a bunch of lazy bums sitting around wanting to get money for nothing, or is it the result of a structural problem where we're not delivering enough good quality jobs? The very way we define groups in the community and policy problems is value-laden before we even start. And if we recognise that, and we recognise that persuasion is involved in the defining of the policy problems in the first place, and then in the construction of the types of solutions we're offering, then we see experts as being part of that persuasive conversation, not as separate and not as sources of information that should trump the information or the views coming from elsewhere in the community.
Great, thanks, Linda. Carolyn.
Thanks. That's a good segue into some of the things I was going to talk about. So I trained and worked as an engineer, environmental engineer, and when I went into the workplace as a sort of problem solver to solve environmental problems, it became very clear, both through my training and also as a practicing engineer, that many of the problems and the politics around environmental issues were indeed value based. And so that drew me to the social sciences around questions of if we do need to have better argumentation, better persuasion, better understanding of the different value bases in our communities, how can we bring those out? How can we have good public debates and have informed decision making, bringing those values to the fore? So that kind of was the seed for me transitioning, if you like, from the physical sciences into the social sciences, was the recognition that, that we need to, that there is a role for having experts, if you like, which is my new role as an expert of trying to bring non-experts into the policy-making process. How do we bring the views and values of everyday people, but also experts, formal experts, into the policy process? How do those sets of knowledges also work together? How do we bring Indigenous knowledge in together to work with more classic forms of formal knowledge? So I guess in my work I've been mostly interested in two big themes about how decision makers, so our politicians, how they reach those decisions and where they bring that advice from, and particularly in terms of listening to their constituents. Are they listening just to their electorate, or how do they feel the pulse? You hear all this commentary in the media about the punters think this or the public want that, and so I've been researching and looking at the politics around citizen engagement particularly. And many of the processes that I've studied have been, these sort of more deliberative processes where there's an attempt to create a kind of Athenian forum where randomly selected citizens come together and become the kind of judges, if you like, the collective wisdom to hear all these value statements by various groups and experts. And so I guess it's about trying to recognise that these collective decisions do pull in different directions, and airing those arguments and airing the expertise is actually a really positive thing and has always been central to democracy. It's just we've often sort of shoved it up to political elites. So the other part of my work has also been about, well, how do we have those kind of conversations outside the sort of formal collective decision making? How do we have that in the public sphere, in the public realm? And I think this is a really big challenge at the moment where we have changing media context, often a very sort of complex issues being deeply sort of simplified, and very, very few spaces for reflection and consideration of issues in a world of lots of voice. So lots of claim making, lots of arguments being sort of thrust out there, but not really very few spaces for people to actually sit together and have those conversations and to wrestle with those trade-offs. So I've been doing some work looking both sort of conceptually at those sorts of things, but also talking with ministers themselves about how they, when it comes to making a collective decision, how do they listen to the public sphere? How do they hear that voice? And I guess the research that I've been doing with a colleague of mine in New Zealand, Jennifer Lees-Marshmont, that's coming out there is showing that we do all these formal consultation processes, which are important, I guess, for legitimacy building. But this was a project that looked at 50 different state secretaries and ministers across 5 democracies. And what they told us was that most of the advice that they're hearing about from the public were through those very formal interactions that they have at the train station, down at the coffee shop. So they find these really much more meaningful interactions. So it's a kind of hidden world of informal policy advice that they're getting. Now, they're not experts on issues, but there's something about the experiential value that these citizens are bringing to these ministerial decisions. So I thought I'd throw that into the mix because it's a kind of, for some people, quite a disturbing finding, but for others it might actually make them feel that actually politicians want to reach out.
Thanks, Carolyn. Deborah.
So my comments will build also on the other participants' comments. So I'm a sociologist, and I'm absolutely interested in finding out what the average person in the street thinks about the issues that I'm interested in researching. And as a sociologist, and like other sociologists, we have a whole repertoire of methods and tools to be able to do that. And that's what really engages me as a social researcher. I haven't had any direct relationship with policymakers, But one of the things that I've really been trying to do, which I think is really important as a social scientist and specifically as a sociologist, is to engage in research, translation and engagement activities, and often social media are a really good way to do that. So the idea is to get your findings out there where you have talked to people and a whole range of different groups, because again, as sociologists, we're interested in different social groups, different socio-demographics, different ages, and how people's attitudes and behaviours and practices might differ compared with other social groups. So I have a colleague, and I love this comment. So he once said that if economics is the dismal science, then sociology is the grumpy science. So I've just stolen his joke, but I always do that. But what I like about that comment is that it does mean that we often, as sociologists, because we are interested in issues of power and social inequality, I mean, we are, as Linda mentioned, as any experts are, we're coming from a position of our own interest, our own, acculturated interests and concerns, and as sociologists we've been trained to look at social difference, to look at social inequalities. I also know that the mass media are constantly using social scientists as experts. I mean, we're constantly, many of us, we get constant requests for interviews and so on. So we are positioned as experts all the time by the mass media for news coverage and commentary and so on. But to some extent that means that the journalists who are covering us as experts and our expert views get to shape how we present ourselves and how our views are presented. And I'm sure I'm not the only one here who's been a bit confronted by having sort of words placed in our mouths by the ways that journalists basically they just want a professor to quote something that they were already going to write anyway in their newspaper article. So how I've circumvented that is using social media. Now, the conversation is great, for those of you who don't read it, I absolutely advocate it, because it is a fantastic forum for social scientists and other academics to write for the general public. And they're gently steered by the trained journalists who know all about how to write for the general public, but they work with the journalists. So that is a great outlet for public engagement and for getting your research findings out there. And it also allows the general public to comment as well, because there's a comments section, so they get to engage with the ideas actively as well. When I first wrote my first article for The Conversation was about 5 years ago, I think, 6 years ago maybe. And when I saw that one day later, 2,000 people had read my article, I thought, okay, this is a great outlet. I should be using this more often, because, of course, as academics, we tend to publish a lot of our research in journals that are behind paywalls that the public can't access unless they pay quite a lot of money to do so. So that started me thinking about other ways that I can engage with the public and get my research findings out there. So the very next day after that first article in The Conversation, I started my own blog, which is still going fairly strongly. And then I thought to myself, how am I going to publicise my blog? I know I'll go on Twitter. So I became an expert in using Twitter, and now I have over, I think, 8,400 followers on Twitter, which is a great way to engage again with the public. So it's not just other academics. Yes, there are other academics following on Twitter, but I also note from the interactions I have on Twitter, because I do a lot of work in digital health, there's general practitioners, there's public health advocacy groups and so on. That form of social media is a great way to engage with publics as well, and to get your views out there, but also engage in a discussion with people who are outside the academy. So I would absolutely advocate for social scientists who want to have more of that engagement with publics to sort of tool up a little bit, to skill up a little bit on how to use social media for that purpose. And finally, I would also say that open access publishing, which is again something that academics haven't become that expert in, but there are now quite a few forums where academics can publish their research findings openly without, again, having to have them behind paywalls. And I think that as social scientists, that's something that, again, invites interaction from publics, gets our research findings out there very quickly and open to everyone. So I would advocate for every social scientist to look into that a bit more than most are currently doing.
Thanks very much, Deborah. And I'd like to thank each of our panellists for a wonderfully provocative set of remarks. Look, I want to start from a place that Sarah opened up for us. Sarah talked a little bit about, at the start, of the need to acknowledge limitations in expertise. And that got me thinking about whether part of the problem and part of the issue that we're confronting at the moment, is it partly the result of experts over-promising? Is that the experts' fault? Or, to go to something that Deborah said, is that us being placed in the realm where we have to overpromise? What's going on here in this kind of overpromising element? I don't know who wants to take that up. Sarah?
Yeah, happy to start. I think a very good place that you see this happening a lot is in the media. So I think everyone actually did mention the media at some point, and it is often whether the media is seeking a particular line, a particular mention, a particular avenue that somebody, an agenda that somebody is driving, that they themselves are probably driving as well, and they want, to have this sort of cross point and say, no, look, I did speak to an academic, I did speak to a politician, I did speak to Joe Bloggs in the street, and what came out was this, standard line. I think that part of the over-promising is people seeking that, only wanting to hear that one side of the story. I think the other side of things is people misidentifying what an expert is. In Indigenous affairs, we have this happen all the time. There are certain names out there in the public sphere that they're very intelligent individuals. They're regularly approached for comment on different things, but part of it is your occupation isn't Aboriginal. Your occupation isn't Torres Strait Islander. Your occupation is, native title lawyer, or your occupation might be GP or school principal or something like that. And so your ability to comment on issues outside of those sorts of things are limited, but the media doesn't really care about that. They sort of see an individual, or they see a background, or they see, an alignment with a certain perspective, and they go, what can you say about this? And often, some people do feel quite trapped and having to say, where am I? Others have found ways around it, and I think that is a really important thing. Social media, that was discussing, and recently in the department, you even hear these quite frightening kind of statements. We were talking about having digital hubs for support for Indigenous businesses. These are basically just an information platform. And we had people say to us, do Aboriginal people use the internet? And, that is like so disheartening and so upsetting in so many ways. And it, obviously didn't come from a place of, their heart's in the right place, but they, really miscommunicated, that kind of thing. And where you then take that is actually, no, we fight back with information. That's just sort of the way that my team works. And we came out with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are 40% more likely to use social media than non-Indigenous Australians. And that's huge. And so how do you then use that kind of information, that kind of activity that people are engaging in on a daily basis, multiple times a day across multiple platforms? How do you use that to your best efforts? And it goes then again to if that information is out there and people are seeing that and hearing more and more and more, I think that sort of opportunity for people to overpromise becomes more and more common, because you say, this is what I believe in, this is my stance, this is my area of expertise, and you go, are you really an expert though? And I think it's that not just misclassification, but also an understanding of what it is to be an expert, understanding that there's a cultural context for what expertise is. I notice a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff will often say, no, I'm not an expert in that, but actually they're probably the most knowledgeable person in the department, either by virtue of experience, either in developing something or having been impacted by something in the past, and are able to bring that experience to the table and design something much better for the future. But you'll have other staff that go, I'm definitely an expert in this, and you go, the degree is great, but what you do with it is the important part. So I think it's a whole kind of suite of things, but you're right, there's a bit of that over-promising going on.
I think there's also an issue too with the fact that people can be expert in an area, and translating their knowledge from their esoteric scientific communities into the broader community. Often caveats have to get lost, because if you think about all the footnotes and so on that are in an academic article and all the caveats and so on, they get lost as we start translating from that small community of researchers into the general public. That becomes problematic. And then when we start seeing the polarisation of public policy debates, the way the media and there's some really interesting research around this coming out of media studies, that as people are being interviewed on these polarised positions, often scientists themselves will present themselves as more certain because they've got a confrontationalist interviewer opposite them. They're not going to admit to the caveats because they want to make a particular point. So there are problems in communication of scientific information and evidence into the community, and we then start seeing the media setting up dueling scientists. Now, going back to my comment about people in the community all sharing the same sets of values, actually we're much closer together on a lot of issues than we think we are. I mean, using the refugee example, the media would have us believe that we've got a class of hard-hearted bastards who want to shoot them at the border and a lot of bleeding heart liberals at the other end who'd let anybody in. Actually, most of us are somewhere in the middle, leaning a bit one way and not the other. But the way the media tends to present these stories is they want to separate us, and then they start pushing the scientists or the experts to put a position. And I have a lot of sympathy for Deborah's comments about the way our material is used in interviews. I've recently had a most unpleasant experience where an editorial was written by an unnamed journalist who used a quotation from me completely out of context to support his particular values position on the topic. So I think the media is really tricky for experts because we don't, unless you do live, and I think live radio is one of the best things to do from that perspective because you can make sure that you're steering. But as soon as we do anything that there's the capacity to edit, immediately our evidence or our expertise is being used by the journalist or the media as a tool in their persuasive position.
Absolutely. Carolyn or
I was just going to say, I do think the media does play a role here, and you've probably got lots to say on that, but I think there are some broader structural forces here in the public sector that also feed into this kind of expert who is an expert and the greyness around it. So take, for example, the rising managerialism and also outsourcing. So in the area of public consultation, there's a lot of both political reasons to outsource consultation, but there's now sort of a huge marketplace of consultants who are the experts in participatory design, right? And it's the same in most areas of public policy. So the experts, they're participating in a kind of marketplace, and so there's that dynamic going on. I think there's also a dynamic going on in terms of just the way in which the public sector has sought to sort of managerialise itself. So the public management kind of reforms also push a particular kind of need to have experts to, a sort of technocratic push. And I do think one of the things we haven't spoken about yet, but we may get to, is I guess the broader erosion of trust in political institutions generally. So not so much the role of experts in politics. I think people are more sort of questioning of the functioning of our political system to actually deliver policy solutions on the ground. And so I'm not sure people have lost their appetite for that policy to be informed by experts. I think they've lost the appetite for the politicians to just not do anything. I think that's what's going on.
So you'd suggest that, the crisis of expertise is part of a broader crisis of institutions of authority in society.
Yeah, and I think the political elites are getting the experts, whoever they are getting wrapped up in that sort of distaste for this political elite and the way in which they aren't doing their job. I mean, that's very simplistic, but that kind of perception that, in some of the other research I'm doing is, a lot of citizens in areas of public policy like renewable energy and care sectors, they're just getting on and doing it themselves. They're forming connections and relationships with the corporate sector because they just feel like the government, state, local, federal, are not moving forward on some reforms. And so they're forming partnerships, social entrepreneurship, cooperatives where they're actually innovating without government.
Yeah, I think that's just true of where public policy is going. I think over sort of the 8 years I've been working directly in Indigenous affairs as opposed to being somebody impacted by the policy, things have slowed down. I think that, a lot of these new policy reforms, instead of saying, your government, has listened to us, even when Kevin Rudd had his big, consultations and all that kind of thing, when he came in, and, you know, set a time frame to deliver it within, you know, that was probably the last time that anybody actually dared promise that. And I don't know whether that's part of the over-promising and under-delivering, but I think we have also a very, very slow, there's so much to work through. It's not just trying to crack through, you know, political will or not. It's now cracking through, is there money? Is there community goodwill for this? Is there state buy-in? Is there local government buy-in? Is there, you know, some sort of lobby group engaged in this? Is there some sort of institution engaged in this? That we also need to get their buy-in before anything even starts to happen. And you just don't break ground for years and years and years. It's slow.
Deborah, did you want to...
Look, I've got a few comments, I guess, just to add on to what everyone else is saying. So one of the frustrations I've had as someone who hasn't actually worked out of the university, you know, I've just been a university person from my first stepping foot on to ANU as a sociology student. But so one of the things I've had to skill myself up in as a sort of ivory tower academic is thinking about ways to engage with policymakers, because I haven't had that on the ground experience that several of you have had. And some of the frustrations around that is knowing that the research that I do could have actually helped policymakers or helped policy initiatives, but how to kind of bridge that gap between the research that I'm doing, talking to everyday Australians about particular issues, and actually getting those findings out to policymakers. And so, again, I think using social media works there, but also one thing that's worked for me is in sort of inserting myself not just in academic conferences, but fronting up to industry conferences and stakeholder conferences, right? So going to digital health conferences, for example, where it's a whole lot of techie people, but I've kind of got up and talked about the social aspects of digital health, and they've been fascinated because they're the ones wanting to develop these tech or to, you know, promote them by government agencies, but they need to know what the barriers and resistances are, what people's lived experiences are of, say, apps and wearable devices and telehealth. And one good example I will just mention is my health record debacle. So as we all know, there's been a huge amount of controversy about the introduction of the opt-out period for my health record, and civil society privacy advocates and groups have been really confronted, and I know the groups have been very confronted by the way that the Digital Health Agency introduced this opt-out period without proper consultation or without proper publicity. Now, if they had come to me, I would have been able to tell them about the research I've done with Australian people about what they think of my health record and what they knew about my health record, which was basically nothing. They hadn't been properly informed about it. And if they had, they didn't want to sign up because they were totally cynical about government. They think government is incompetent. That's basically what they said. You know, one person said, look, they don't even know how to press the on switch on a computer because there's been so many scandals around the incompetencies of government agencies around census fail, robo-debt and so on. So it seems to me that social scientists are doing the kind of important and interesting, useful work for policy makers and for policy initiatives, but for some of us at least, myself included, I would like to, you know, how to bridge that gap, how to get those findings out there is something that I would like to sort of spend more time thinking about.
Can I jump in
Sure.
on that? That's a really important issue, but I mean, I think for the social sciences, a lot of the contribution that we have to make is actually the enlightenment function. It's actually the sort of thing you're doing, the sort of thing Carolyn's doing, which is actually getting out there and talking to the general public and raising their awareness, because the bottom line for public servants is that they are resource poor, time poor. You know, they've got to get that cabinet submission done by Tuesday of next week, and if they don't, they're in trouble. They don't have time to be scouring the academic journals for the latest research and so on. So there's several different roles that academics can kind of play in the policy space. They can invest a lot of time in making connections with people in the fields that they work in. And they basically become boundary players, you know, between the space between social science research and policy. But then, of course, their academic bosses are saying, but why aren't there enough journal articles coming out? You're spending so much time in government departments. So you can kind of think of there being about 3 or 4 different roles that scientists can play in the policy space. You've got your pure scientists, which in the caricature is, you know, the white-coated scientist who just produces knowledge for the body of human knowledge and then hopes somebody will find it if it happens to be useful. Then you've got people that perhaps like the consultants who are employed specifically to do specific things and they're contracted to do it. Then there are people who answer questions that they're asked. And each of these different roles that we can play as researchers require different amounts of investment. And then we're engaging in trade-offs between the expectations of our academic life, which is requiring publications in Q1 and Q2 journals and getting our H indices up and all those sorts of things, which means we don't have as much time for the engagement. And I think that's one of the challenges, not just for us, but for people in the natural sciences as well, is working out how much time we want to invest in that interface. And I think we do have the advantages in the social sciences that we can engage with the broader public perhaps more freely, because what we're doing is something that they can relate to quite well. And if we can influence the public policy debate through things like our Twitter conversations and our publications, and get people more broadly thinking about our ideas, we might not get cited, but they will get there into the conversation. But we do have to remember the resource constraints that are facing public policymakers. I mean, there's nowhere near the numbers of people in the public service that there were when I joined a very long time ago, last century. And there's nowhere near the people, there's nowhere near the money and the time constraints and so on, make it very difficult for public servants themselves to be actively seeking out research.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a million more questions I would like to ask the panel, but would anyone like to pose any questions at all to the panel or raise issues? Please.
I, for a long time, was a public servant, and I would always say that I had no particular interest in what researchers had to say about any subject, any more than I had an interest in what a hairdresser or a baker might have to say. However, I had a huge amount of interest in what research had to say about whatever I was working on. And I think part of the problem was a lot of the experts in natural sciences or social sciences found it really difficult to make that distinction, would often try and act as advocates rather than as advisors, and didn't understand that as soon as you became an advocate, you weren't really playing a particularly useful role from my point of view as somebody who was actually having to advise on policy. And so, for example, when I worked at CSIRO, I introduced a rule that CSIRO would only ever put in one submission to a government inquiry, rather than individual divisions putting in their own submissions based upon their own disciplinary interests and what have you, and their own set of values, which, as you say, vary according to disciplines. And the poor people responsible for managing the inquiry then having the premier scientific body within Australia providing contradictory advice. And one of the interesting things is if you actually do that and you get people from different areas of research having to contribute, you may well find that the conclusion you reach is that the research really doesn't have anything serious to contribute because of disagreements between the disciplines, between the experts. But that's useful in itself to know. So I think it's views that you have about this distinction between an individual research project and research generally, and between an advisor and an advocate.
So Sarah, I might use that to ask you, as a government official, particularly in the area of Indigenous affairs, how do you respond when experts fundamentally disagree about the same thing?
Yeah, so it's a definite problem. It happens all the time. And it is often as a result of some of the silos that you mentioned, and breaking those down is so important. But I think the other thing is often these conflicts of information, as opposed to necessarily conflicts of opinion, have arisen because the key cohort that we're often dealing with here, which is Indigenous Australians, haven't been included from the outset. So I think that you're the biggest expert on your own life, and we often don't actually utilise that information out there, and instead we'll raise it to a point where we go, okay, what does the peak body on this particular topic say? And here's another organisation that works in that same area, and they're conflicting views. Well, that is quite a challenge when actually we need quite a tailored response to a particular area. So I think there's a couple of good examples happening in Indigenous affairs at the moment. I think one of them is we have a new special envoy for remote school attendance just been announced, and that's somebody who's bringing a lot of perhaps opinion to the table as opposed to a lot of evidence to the table, in the same way that a lot of those people that are bringing the evidence to the table are operating in different environments. Some are working in very remote and very disadvantaged communities, others are operating in larger regional centres, and trying to make that, you don't have one policy that, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. So there's that as well. There's also just general, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are just like every other Australian. We all have different opinions. We often have multiple opinions on the same thing coming out of the same person. And I think that instead of seeing everybody as like a homogenous group, especially with things like constitutional recognition, the truth-telling process that people are pushing for at the moment, people just genuinely want to get a lot of stuff out on the table. And I think sometimes it is actually nice to see where things do conflict. You can have people from the same family, from the same community group, from the same nation, from the same mob, all having a different opinion, and that's really valuable to know about. And so sometimes just making it possible for people to bring those different pieces of evidence, sometimes portrayed as opinion or perspective instead of actual fact, is really valuable, because then you know what you've got to work with.
So, our other panellists, advocacy versus advice, is that a
I think
a
that,
line?
well, that's part of this role that different researchers can take, is there are researchers who are advocates. But I think part of the challenge for social science is that we are part of the communities that we're studying. We are bound to have opinions. And certainly political science is particularly difficult, because if I'm being interviewed, and I've done some work on the National Party, for example, and I'm being interviewed about the National Party, the average person in their lounge room will have an opinion on the National Party. Where does my expertise based on my research on the National Party differ from my opinion as a voter on the National Party? Because I'm the same person, and obviously the two interact with each other. So particularly for social science, it's very difficult to separate who you are and what your values are and what you believe from your research. And when it comes to opinion, opinion is often based in expertise. So I might have an opinion on something, but it's based on the fact that I might have been researching that topic for 20 years. So it's an expert-informed opinion. So I think we have to be very careful about this idea that somehow the research stands as a bunch of facts separate from the people who've done the research, because I think that the research has been shaped and guided by the people who've made the choices about what they're going to research and how they're going to go about researching it, and the way that they choose to communicate it. Which parts of that research are they going to highlight as being the most important elements? And I'd just like to share with you, if I could, just an anecdote from some research I was doing a few years ago. I was quite fascinated about the obesity discourse and about how we're suffering from a global obesity epidemic and so on. I was thinking, well, what does the science tell us about this? So a few years ago, I did a research project with a colleague, and we actually went back to some of the scientific literature to look at whether the science was as settled about overweight and obesity as the media suggested. We did, partly exploring this idea that caveats get lost between the science and the publication in journals and so on. And we came across a lovely journal article written by some experts who discovered that there was a U-shaped relationship between weight, as measured through a body mass index, and health outcomes. So it's U-shaped. In other words, being underweight was bad for you as much as being overweight. And in fact, being a couple of kilos underweight is worse for you than being a couple of kilos overweight. So this was the finding, this was the key finding from this journal article. But towards the end of the article, the authors themselves said, yep, so we found this relationship, but we all know obesity is a much bigger problem, so let's keep the leanness end of the distribution for scientific debate. In other words, we don't think it's important to tell the general public about the fact it's bad for you if you're skinny. We're going to keep the focus on just because we know obesity. This is a values choice. And from the point of view of public servants making policy, that's actually potentially got serious outcomes, because if the discourse is all about we're all putting on masses of weight and it's bad for us, and you then have a universal lose weight now message in the community, the groups in the community that research tells us take up the lose weight now message with the greatest enthusiasm are teenage girls who are least likely to need the message. Now, if we have a blanket message based on scientists telling us that obesity is the problem, we are potentially creating health problems for people at the other end of the distribution that science knows are going to be at risk, but has made those values choices that their communication is going to be purely about part of the distribution. So at every stage in the process, choices are being made about what we research, how we research it, and how we then communicate it. And this then becomes a challenge for policymakers who are trying to use this information in developing the best policies for the community as a whole.
Great points. Other questions or comments? Yeah, please.
I have a question about, does anyone on the panel have any views about, the kind of media ownership saturation and whether we're at a tipping point and what we can do now, I guess?
So media ownership, does distributions of media ownership,
Media.
this sounds like you, Deborah,
Media.
play into this?
That saturation of media ownership or conglomeration of media ownership has been a problem for a long time. But it's even more of a problem now because, of course, the business model of journalism has failed and each news outlet is just fighting for its survival. And we're now in the era of clickbait journalism, of course, and we're in the era where sometimes to serve the bottom line, which is rapidly diminishing in front of the newspaper owners' eyes, they have to go back to what we've been talking about before. We had the exaggerating expert opinion and presenting a very black and white view of issues, being highly controversial, where it's actually would have been much better to be nuanced and balanced about news coverage. So, if we get back to the key question about the role of experts, of course, the news media has been very much criticised for the way that they've covered news in recent times, from Trump down. But we're also getting, I think, a sort of a backlash against that now, where quality news is now beginning to be recognised as for what it is, as news that's not written in 5 seconds for clickbait, but as a reputable news outlet. So I would sort of, ending on a hopeful note, that I would see that, and outlets like The Conversation, I would just, don't want to talk too much about The Conversation, but I just happened to notice today they had an overview about the role that they played as an expert authority and what they did for quality assurance and so on. I thought that was really interesting given the light of this discussion today. And the balances and checks that they have in checking facts and so on. So I would say that the public is beginning to recognise the importance of that kind of stuff and the importance of the news media not being owned by too few people and only in the interests of profit rather than quality.
Can I just add something on that? I think there's the role of this mass media and its influence up on the hill and in the sort of premier's departments all around Australia. And I think that agglomeration is really problematic because you've got a lot of concentrated power of a few individual shock jocks that are kind of, in the latest leadership spill, we might have even said that sort of forced upon them by some particular individuals. So you've got that dynamic happening, but then I think you've got a dynamic in the public realm where I think a lot of people possibly aren't paying for that kind of agglomerated media. So they're sourcing their media from other areas. And I guess one of the dynamics that I've sort of found in my research on one particular political controversy in a regional context is that people, are finding their information, their expertise online and often in Facebook communities. So this is on a coal seam gas controversy that's playing out in rural New South Wales. And they don't feel like the mass media is listening, the local regional paper's not listening. So they're sourcing all their information, this is both sides of the controversy, in their little enclaves. And that's when I think it gets very problematic. So you've got the concentration at the kind of elite level of our mass media, but then you've got, a social media, which I think is helping those enclaves get informed, often through their own experts and counter-experts. But the problem that we notice in this controversy anyway is that they're not being exposed to difference. And that's very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, that's, I think, a good place to finish on. We're right up against time. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion, and I'd like you all to join me, please, in thanking Sarah Burr, Linda Botterill, Carolyn Hendricks and Deborah Lupton. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along. Some wonderful discussion that you started here. I'm sure it's not the end of the conversation. I'd like to encourage you all to continue to take part in an enthusiastic way in Social Sciences Week as well, and look forward to other events next year. Thanks very much.